In 1884, wealthy New Yorkers lived in private mansions. They would never share a roof with strangers. They would never ride elevators with neighbors. Apartments were for immigrants and the poor. Then a strange fortress rose on the edge of Central Park. Critics called it madness. They called it a wilderness palace. Within 5 years, every apartment was full. There was a waiting list. The building that skeptics mocked had become the most desired address in America. This is the story of how apartment buildings changed elite living forever. If you find this story fascinating, take a moment to subscribe to support the channel. It means a lot. And I also welcome you to share your opinions in the comments below. The year was 1880. New York City was growing fast. Immigrants poured through the harbor. Factories multiplied along the rivers, but the wealthy lived as they always had, in private homes. Grand townhouses lined Fifth Avenue from Washington Square north past 50th Street. Each family occupied their own building. They had their own servants, their own carriage houses, their own private gardens hidden behind iron gates. This was not just preference. This was identity. A mansion meant you had arrived. Sharing a building with other families meant you could not afford your own. It meant you were common. It meant you did not belong to society. The apartment buildings that did exist served the working class and immigrants. The Lower East Side was packed with them. Tenements rose 5 and 6 stories, dark, crowded, airless. Families lived in 2 or 3 rooms. They shared toilets and hallways. They hung laundry from fire escapes. These buildings were not homes, they were warehouses for human beings. Some middle-class apartments had appeared. The Stuyvesant on East 18th Street opened in 1869. Architect Richard Morris Hunt designed it for respectable professionals, doctors, lawyers, merchants. The units were modest but clean. The building proved successful enough to inspire others. But nobody imagined the truly wealthy would ever accept such arrangements. The rich had too much at stake. Living in a mansion demonstrated your success to the world. Your address announced your status. The size of your home reflected the size of your fortune. Abandoning that for an apartment, no matter how nice, meant admitting you could not maintain a proper establishment. There were practical concerns as well. How could you control who lived beside you? Your neighbor might be anyone, someone vulgar, someone in trade, someone whose money was too new or whose family was too obscure. In your own mansion, you controlled everything, your walls, your grounds, your privacy, but maintaining a mansion was exhausting. The burden fell heaviest on women. A proper household required constant supervision. You needed a cook, a scullery maid, a laundress, parlor maids, chamber maids, a butler, footmen, a coachman, stable boys. Finding good servants was difficult. Training them took months. Keeping them required vigilance. Then there was the physical maintenance. Furnaces needed coal, lamps needed oil and then later gas, carpets needed beating, silver needed polishing, windows needed washing, gardens needed tending, something always needed repair. The boiler leaked, the roof leaked, pipes froze in winter, the work never ended. Wealthy women spent their days managing these details. They planned menus with cooks. They inspected linen closets with housekeepers. They supervised deliveries. They scheduled repairs. Their lives revolved around domestic management. It was expected, it was proper, but it was also relentless. Some families maintained multiple residences, a townhouse in Manhattan, a summer cottage in Newport, perhaps a hunting lodge in the Adirondacks. Each property required its own staff. Each needed constant oversight. The logistics were overwhelming. Meanwhile, in Europe, the situation was different. Wealthy Parisian families lived comfortably in apartment buildings. They occupied entire floors of grand structures. They enjoyed shared courtyards and professional building management. In Vienna, in London, in cities across the continent, apartments carried no stigma. The European elite had discovered something American society had not yet grasped. You could live graciously without the burden of maintaining your own palace. A few Americans noticed this. They traveled to Europe. They stayed in grand hotels. They visited friends in Parisian apartments. They saw how the wealthy lived abroad, and they wondered why New York could not offer something similar. Edward Clark was one of those people. He had watched European cities for years. He had seen how apartment living worked. He understood its appeal, and he had the fortune to attempt something radical. Clark was born in 1811 in upstate New York. He trained as a lawyer and built a respectable practice. He married Caroline Jordan and remained faithful to her until her death. He was careful, conservative, devoted to order and routine. He was not the sort of man anyone would expect to revolutionize urban living. But Clark had a partner who was the opposite in every way. Isaac Merritt Singer was tall, handsome, and utterly without conscience. He was born the same year as Clark, 1811, but where Clark followed rules, Singer broke them constantly. Singer left home at age 12 with almost no education. He wanted to become a famous actor. For nearly 20 years, he wandered the country with traveling theater groups. The performances rarely paid well, but Singer discovered he had other talents. He could charm people, he could persuade them, and he had a gift for mechanical invention. By 1850, Singer was working in a Boston machine shop. His employer asked him to repair a sewing machine. Singer studied the device and realized he could build something better. Within 11 days, working 18 to 20 hours at a stretch, he constructed a prototype that would change the world. His machine could sew continuously on any part of a garment. It could handle curves, not just straight lines. A skilled operator could produce 900 stitches per minute. Nothing like it existed. Singer secured a patent in August 1851. A new industry was born, but Singer was not a businessman. He needed a partner who understood money and contracts. He found Edward Clark. The two men formed a company in 1851. Their partnership was contentious from the start. They disagreed on nearly everything, but they needed each other. Singer had the invention. Clark had the business skills. Clark proved to be a brilliant marketer. He created the first installment payment plan in America. Sewing machines cost over $100. The average family earned perhaps $500 per year. Nobody could afford such a luxury up front. Clark's solution was revolutionary. He allowed customers to pay a small amount each month. Suddenly, middle-class housewives could own Singer sewing machines. Sales exploded. While Clark built the business, Singer built families. His legal wife, Catherine Maria Haley, had given him 2 children before he abandoned her. He then established a household with Mary Ann Sponsler. She believed herself to be his wife. She gave him 10 children. At the same time, Singer was involved with Mary McGonigal. She bore him 5 more children under the assumed family name Matthews. There were others as well. Singer moved between these households with astonishing audacity. He kept them ignorant of one another for years. The arrangement collapsed in 1860. Mary Ann Sponsler spotted Singer driving down Fifth Avenue in an open carriage. Mary McGonigal sat beside him. The confrontation that followed made headlines across the city. Investigators discovered the full scope of Singer's deception. 4 families in Manhattan alone, at least 16 children. The scandal was enormous. Accused of bigamy and adultery, Singer fled to England. There he met Isabella Eugenie Boyer. She was 19 years old, French, strikingly beautiful. Singer married her in 1863. They produced 6 more children together. Singer never returned to America. He built an enormous estate in England called the Wigwam. It was reportedly one of the largest private homes in the country. He died there in July 1875. He left behind a fortune of about $13 million. In today's currency, that equals over $300 million. His will divided the money among 20 of his surviving children, but not equally. One son who had supported his mother during divorce proceedings received only $500. Even in death, Singer played favorites. Edward Clark emerged from this chaos with control of the Singer Manufacturing Company. He had spent 2 decades managing the business while Singer lived irresponsibly. Now the fortune was his. Clark was 64 years old. He was one of the wealthiest men in America, and he was ready for something new. He turned his attention to real estate. Specifically to a radical idea. He would build an apartment house, not for the working class, not for immigrants, for the rich, for families who currently lived in private mansions. Everyone told him it was impossible. The wealthy would never consent to live beside strangers. They would never ride elevators with neighbors. They would never abandon the privacy and prestige of their own homes. Clark listened to the skeptics. Then he began planning. He studied what had worked elsewhere. In 1879, he commissioned architect Henry Janeway Hardenberg to design a modest apartment building called the Van Corlear on 7th Avenue near 55th Street. The structure cost about $8,000 per unit to build. It attracted solid, respectable tenants. The Van Corlear was a test. Clark wanted to see if the concept could work. It did, but he wanted something grander, something that would prove once and for all that luxury apartment living was possible in America. The site he selected made observers question his sanity. In 1880, the Upper West Side was barely a neighborhood. It was mostly empty land. The area west of Central Park remained largely undeveloped. Contemporary visitors described a landscape of rocky outcrops and scattered wooden structures. Acre after acre of open ground stretched toward the Hudson River. The few buildings that existed were modest. Some plots still functioned as small farms or pasture land. The contrast with the Upper East Side was extreme. East of Central Park, elegant town houses lined the avenues. The wealthy had moved there as soon as the park opened in the 1860s. But the West Side, with its steeper terrain and lack of amenities, had attracted almost no investment. Land was cheap precisely because nobody wanted it. Clark purchased a plot at the corner of 72nd Street and 8th Avenue. The site covered about 41,000 square feet. The location offered certain advantages. The street was wide, measuring 100 feet across. The plot sat on a slight rise with views across much of the island, and Central Park lay directly to the east. But these advantages meant nothing to skeptics. The distance from fashionable society seemed impossible to overcome. New York's social and commercial life centered far to the south and east. The Upper West Side felt like another world. Critics began calling Clark's project his folly. The nickname started as a joke. It became a persistent taunt as construction progressed. The name Dakota emerged during this period. Clark had a fondness for the names of new western states and territories. He had even proposed renaming some of the Upper West Side avenues after western places. The city rejected his suggestions. Whether the building's name came from Clark's preferences or from jokes about its remote location remains unclear, but the name stuck. The Dakota, as if it were in the Western Territories instead of Manhattan. There were practical reasons for skepticism beyond snobbery. The Upper West Side had almost no transportation connections. Walking to the business districts downtown would take well over an hour. Horse-drawn omnibuses were slow and unreliable. Then in 1879, the 9th Avenue Elevated Railway opened. For the first time, direct transit linked the Upper West Side to Lower Manhattan. This development influenced Clark's thinking. With reliable transportation available, the area's isolation seemed less permanent. Clark understood something about the emerging American elite. Not everyone who could afford luxury actually wanted the burden of maintaining a private mansion. He told the West Side Association in December 1879 that few persons were princely enough to occupy an entire palace. Many successful professionals would welcome apartment living, but only if the apartments were grand enough to satisfy their pride. His solution was to create something New York had never seen. Not merely an apartment building, a palace divided into private homes. Each residence would offer the space and privacy and luxury of a mansion, but the burdens of maintenance, heating, and staffing would be shared. Residents could enjoy the benefits of wealth without endless responsibilities. This was Clark's gamble as he approached 70 years old. The Singer fortune had made him rich beyond measure. He had no need to prove anything to anyone. When asked why he wanted to become a real estate developer so late in life, his answer was direct. He wanted to make money, but something more seemed to drive him. Clark appeared determined to demonstrate that his vision was correct. He would construct his apartment palace in the wilderness. He would fill it with the finest materials available. He would prove the skeptics wrong. Work began in late October 1880. Clark hired Hardenberg again, but where the Van Corlear had been modest, this new structure would be monumental. Clark instructed Hardenberg to spare no expense. The construction budget reached about $2 million. Individual apartments would cost roughly $25,000 each to build. That was more than 3 times what Clark had spent per unit at the Van Corlear. The skeptics watched as the massive structure rose from the empty lots. They continued to call it folly. They continued to predict failure. Edward Clark ignored them all. He had bet his reputation on an idea. Now he would see it through. Henry Janeway Hardenberg was 33 years old when Edward Clark asked him to design the Dakota. The architect had already proven himself with the Van Corlear. Now Clark wanted something far more ambitious, a structure that would silence every critic who doubted that wealthy New Yorkers could live in apartments. Hardenberg came from a family of Dutch descent in New Jersey. He was born in 1847 in New Brunswick. He received his early education at the Hasbrouck Institute in Jersey City. Rather than attending a formal architecture school, he followed the traditional path of apprenticeship. From 1865 to 1870, he trained under Detlef Leno. Leno was a German-born architect who had studied at the prestigious École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. This background proved crucial. Leno exposed his young apprentice to European design traditions that most American architects knew only from books. By 1870, Hardenberg had established his own practice in New York. His early commissions were modest: a chapel and library for Rutgers College, some residential projects in New Jersey. The Van Corlear represented his first major opportunity. When that structure succeeded, Clark saw no reason to look elsewhere. The design Hardenberg created for the Dakota defies easy classification. Architectural historians have argued about its style for over a century. Some describe it as German Renaissance revival. They point to the high gables, deep roofs, and robust ornamentation that recall the town halls of Northern Europe. Others see French influences. They suggest the design evokes the chateau architecture of the Francis I period. One critic writing decades later dismissed such neat categories entirely. He called it brewery brick Victorian neo-Gothic eclectic. Perhaps the confusion is appropriate. Hardenberg seems to have drawn freely from multiple traditions. He combined elements in ways that felt original rather than derivative. The result was unlike anything New York had seen. The structure rises 8 stories above street level. An additional floor is tucked beneath the steep roof lines. At the time of completion, this made it one of the taller residential buildings in Manhattan. The exterior is composed primarily of buff-colored brick. It is trimmed with sandstone and decorated with terracotta panels. The roof line bristles with dormers, gables, and chimneys. The silhouette resembles a Hasidic town hall more than a New York residence. Hardenberg organized the structure around a central courtyard. The footprint is roughly square. The interior space forms an H shape when viewed from above. This arrangement served multiple practical purposes. The courtyard allowed natural light to reach apartments on all 4 sides. It provided ventilation in an era before air conditioning, and it offered residents a private outdoor space shielded from the noise and chaos of city streets. The main entrance faces 72nd Street through a grand archway. This porte-cochere measures about 16 feet wide and 20 feet tall. Horse-drawn carriages could pass through comfortably. Residents arriving home could be deposited directly in the courtyard, protected from weather, shielded from public view. The arrangement offered the kind of privacy that mansion dwellers expected, translated into the context of a shared structure. Above the entrance, architectural details proliferate: terracotta panels, decorative ironwork, carved stonework. According to some accounts, portraits of a man and woman appear above the door. They possibly depict Isaac Singer and his wife Isabella, though this identification remains uncertain. A figure that appears to represent a Native American looks out from the roof line, perhaps a nod to the name and its associations with the Western Territories. Inside, Hardenberg planned 65 individual apartments. No 2 would be identical. This was a deliberate choice. It reflected Clark's understanding of his intended residents. Wealthy families moving from private mansions would expect their homes to feel unique, not like standardized units stamped from a common mold. The apartments ranged from 4 rooms to as many as 20. They accommodated everything from modest households to sprawling family establishments with numerous servants. The internal circulation system reflected the rigid social hierarchies of the Gilded Age. 4 main staircases and 4 passenger elevators occupied the corners of the courtyard. They provided access for residents, but servants used entirely separate routes. 4 additional service staircases and 4 service elevators were positioned at the midpoints of each courtyard side. They led directly to kitchens and back rooms. A resident might never encounter a delivery person. They would never see a servant carrying groceries. The 2 worlds operated in parallel. They shared the same structure but rarely crossed paths. The courtyard itself was divided into 2 levels. The upper level at street grade served residents exclusively. Below it, accessible by ramps descending from both 72nd and 73rd Streets, a lower level handled all service functions. Delivery wagons could enter, unload their goods, and depart. They never appeared in the spaces reserved for wealthy occupants. This separation addressed a criticism that had reportedly plagued the Van Corlear. There, grocery carts and ice wagons cluttered the courtyard alongside residents' carriages. Construction employed several techniques considered innovative for the era. The foundation walls measured an estimated 3 to 4 feet thick. They provided exceptional stability for a structure of this size. Rather than the newer steel frame methods then being developed, the Dakota used traditional load-bearing masonry. Iron beams and concrete floors provided additional support. Between the layers of flooring, workers reportedly packed mud taken from Central Park. The technique was intended to provide both soundproofing and fire resistance. Hardenberg paid careful attention to the arrangement of rooms within each apartment. Following French precedent, he designed layouts where all major rooms connected to one another in sequence. This pattern was called enfilade. But unlike pure French designs, he also provided corridor access to each room. Family members and guests could move about without passing through every space in between. Servants could reach any room through separate back passages. They never disturbed the household. Principal rooms faced outward toward the streets. Dining rooms, kitchens, and secondary spaces oriented toward the courtyard. This arrangement ensured that the most important rooms received the best light and views. Functional spaces made do with more modest interior exposures. Apartments on both sides of the structure received air and light from 2 directions. This was a relative novelty in Manhattan residential design at that time. The mechanical systems were remarkably advanced. Clark had specified that the Dakota should offer every modern convenience. Hardenberg delivered. The structure would have its own power plant. It would generate electricity at a time when much of Manhattan still relied on gas lighting. A central heating system would warm not just the Dakota itself but potentially surrounding structures as well. Hydraulic elevators, still a relatively new technology, would carry residents to upper floors with ease. To reassure nervous residents about safety, the power plant was positioned not within the main structure but beneath a garden on the adjacent lot to the west. If the boilers exploded, as steam engines occasionally did in that era, the damage would not directly threaten the apartments. This placement reflected both practical engineering and psychological insight. Clark understood that his wealthy tenants would need reassurance before trusting their families to such novel arrangements. Edward Clark understood that convincing wealthy New Yorkers to abandon their townhouses would require more than architectural grandeur. The Dakota needed to offer a way of life. Every comfort of mansion living delivered without the burden of managing it yourself. From the moment a resident stepped through the porte-cochere, everything should feel effortless, gracious, complete. The interiors reflected this ambition. Craftsmen spent months on details that most visitors would never consciously notice. Ceilings of hand-carved oak, each panel shaped by skilled woodworkers, floors inlaid with patterns of marble, mahogany, oak, and cherry, fireplaces with hand-carved marble mantels. Reportedly no two alike in the entire structure. Door frames and moldings that spoke of old European craftsmanship transplanted to the New World. For his own apartment, Clark allegedly went further still. According to accounts that have circulated for decades, he specified floors inlaid with sterling silver. Whether this extraordinary detail was ever actually installed remains a matter of debate. Clark died before the Dakota opened. His apartment passed to other occupants, but the story persists, a testament to the extravagance that characterized the entire project. The individual apartments offered prospective tenants something no New York residents had provided before. Customization on a grand scale. Clark apparently encouraged buyers to modify their units according to personal taste. Walls could be moved, rooms could be combined or divided. The result was that the 65 apartments, already designed to be unique, became even more individualized as their first occupants shaped them to particular needs. But the Dakota's most revolutionary feature was not any single apartment. It was the services that would surround them. On the ground floor, Clark created a dining establishment designed to rival the finest restaurants in the city. Contemporary descriptions suggest the main dining room was finished in the manner of an English baronial hall. Marble floors, walls paneled in carved English oak, bronze bas-relief work on the upper walls, ceilings of quartered oak intricately carved. A massive Scottish brownstone fireplace dominated the center of the space. Adjacent rooms provided a ladies' dining area and chambers for dinner parties. Residents who preferred to eat in their own apartments could do so with remarkable ease. A network of dumbwaiters connected the dining facilities to individual kitchens throughout the structure. Meals prepared by professional staff could be delivered hot and fresh, ready to be served by a family's own servants. The arrangement offered the convenience of hotel living with the privacy of a home. The staff required to maintain this operation would be enormous. Clark planned for about 150 employees to work within the walls. Elevator operators and doormen were merely the visible few. Behind the scenes would labor a resident housekeeper supervising a team of maids. A laundress would manage her own staff in dedicated facilities. There was to be a gentleman's tailor in the basement. A house carpenter, 2 house painters, a cabinet maker, an electrician, a plumber, a glazier. The Dakota would function less like an apartment house and more like a self-contained village. Laundry service exemplified the level of care planned. Staff would collect soiled items from each apartment in special wicker baskets. The garments would return washed, ironed, and mended. Buttons replaced, tiers repaired. Each piece was to be separated with sheets of pink tissue paper according to later accounts of the service. For families accustomed to managing their own household staff, this represented an extraordinary reduction in daily concerns. The upper floors would house the army of servants who made this lifestyle possible. The 8th floor contained quarters for personal servants employed by individual families. It also had communal dormitories for male and female staff with shared bathrooms. The 9th floor held laundry facilities with drying areas extending onto the roof. These spaces were functional rather than elegant, a hidden world designed to support the gracious living below. Even the roof offered amenities. Children's play areas occupied portions of the upper level. They provided safe outdoor space for young residents. Parents could allow their children to play without concern for street traffic or the dangers of an unfinished neighborhood. Some contemporary accounts mention promenades with gazebos and canopied sunshades. They offered views across Central Park and the developing city beyond. On the adjacent western lot, above the mechanical plant, Clark planned recreational grounds. Tennis courts and croquet lawns would give residents access to fashionable outdoor pursuits without leaving home. Gardens would provide green space in a neighborhood that still lacked public amenities. The arrangement meant that families could enjoy many pleasures of a country estate while living at the center of Manhattan. The heating system deserves particular mention. Steam radiators would warm every apartment from a central source. This eliminated the need for individual furnaces and the staff to maintain them. Residents would never need to worry about ordering coal. They would never manage boilers. They would never deal with the soot and ash that plagued individual homes. The entire burden of keeping warm through New York winters would simply vanish. All of this came with staff dedicated to anticipating problems before residents even noticed them. The bronze fixtures would be polished regularly, the mahogany oiled, the brass rubbed, the floors waxed. Clark envisioned a level of maintenance that would preserve the Dakota's grandeur for generations. What Clark planned was not merely an apartment house, it was a machine for gracious living. Every inconvenience of home ownership had been considered and eliminated. The burden of finding reliable servants, managing household repairs, coordinating deliveries, maintaining grounds and equipment, all of it would vanish into the capable hands of professional staff. Residents would pay their rent and live like aristocrats. For families weighing the decision to leave their townhouses, the Dakota offered a compelling argument. The same money that barely maintained an individual home in fashionable Manhattan could provide access to services that even the wealthiest households struggled to match. The Dakota promised not a diminished life but an enhanced one, less responsibility, more comfort, the pleasures of wealth without endless obligations. This was Clark's vision made tangible, not simply a place to live, a way of living that had never before existed in America. A palace divided into homes where the palace itself took care of everything. Construction progressed through 1881 and 1882. The massive structure gradually took shape on the undeveloped lots of the Upper West Side. New Yorkers watched with fascination and skepticism, but Edward Clark would not live to see his project completed. Edward Clark never walked through the finished Dakota. In the autumn of 1882, as workers swarmed over the rising structure at 72nd Street, Clark fell ill at his country estate in Cooperstown. He was 70 years old. He had accumulated one of the great American fortunes, and he had spent the past 2 years watching his most ambitious project take shape. The walls had reached their full height. The distinctive gables and dormers were being fitted. From upstate New York, he could picture the completed building, the tenants who would fill it. The vindication of every skeptic who had laughed at his wilderness apartment house. He would not live to see any of it. Edward Clark died of malarial fever on October 14, 1882. The Dakota was roughly 2 years from completion. The man who had conceived it, financed it, and defended it against ridicule would never stand in its courtyard. He would never dine in its baronial hall. He would never occupy the lavish apartment he had planned for himself. His obituaries focused on the Singer Manufacturing Company, on the fortune he had built, on the legal brilliance that had made it possible. The strange apartment house rising on the Upper West Side received mention as an eccentricity, a footnote to a more conventional success story. Clark's estate was valued at about $25 million. Some estimates ran as high as $50 million. This staggering sum, equivalent to well over $500 million today, reflected decades of careful investment and his dominant stake in Singer. His will distributed portions to various family members, but the bulk of his real estate holdings, including the unfinished Dakota, passed to his grandson Edward Severin Clark. The boy was just 12 years old. This created an immediate problem. A child could not manage a fortune, let alone oversee the completion of the most ambitious residential building in New York history. Trustees stepped in to handle the estate during Edward Severin's minority. These men, presumably selected by Clark himself, would guide the Dakota to completion according to the original plans. Whatever adjustments or economies might have tempted lesser stewards, the trustees appear to have honored the founders' intentions in full. Construction continued through the winter of 1882 and into 1883. Henry Hardenbergh remained as architect. He supervised the finishing work that would transform a shell into a residence. In August 1883, plasterers went on strike. They protested the employment of non-union laborers. Other tradesmen briefly joined them. But within a month, work resumed. Craftsmen completed the interior details that had been specified so carefully. The mechanical systems were fitted into place. Workers laid the intricate floor patterns, they hung the heavy doors, they prepared every surface for the residents who would soon arrive. The neighborhood around the Dakota was changing as well. The building's presence had announced that the Upper West Side was open for development. Other investors, emboldened by Clark's gamble, began their own projects. Streets that had been empty lots in 1880 were showing signs of life. By 1884, the elevated railway brought more traffic. Shops and services began to appear. The Dakota would not stand quite so alone as its creator had originally feared. By September 1884, the Real Estate Record reported that the Dakota would be ready for occupancy on October 1st. Yearly rents would range from $1,500 to $5,000. But here was the remarkable thing. 1/4 of the units had already been rented. By the time the building officially opened in late October, every single apartment was spoken for. Not a vacancy remained. The Dakota was completed by the final week of October 1884, about 4 years after construction had begun. Whatever doubts fashionable New Yorkers had harbored about living so far uptown, whatever concerns they had expressed about apartment life itself, the finished product answered most objections. This was no tenement. This was not even the respectable but modest middle-class experiment that had preceded it. This was something genuinely new, and New York's wealthy had recognized it before the doors even opened. The first tenants represented exactly the class Clark had hoped to attract: lawyers, brokers, merchants, a clothier, a cigar merchant, a coal mine operator. Even a stenographer. They were prosperous but not particularly famous. None appeared on the 400, that exclusive list of New York society's inner circle. The Dakota's remoteness still posed challenges. In an age before telephones became common, social visits required travel. Reaching the building from the Ladies' Mile shopping district could take an hour. But the tenants came nonetheless, drawn by what Clark had built. Reports from those early months suggest that the Dakota delivered on its promises. The systems functioned. The services materialized as advertised. Residents found themselves freed from the demands that had made home ownership so exhausting. They could focus on their lives, their work, their social obligations. The building itself handled everything else. Critics who had dismissed the project as folly were forced to reconsider. The New York Daily Graphic declared it one of the most perfect apartment houses in the world. The Real Estate Record praised both the architect and his client. What had seemed like madness in 1880 had become shrewd judgment by 1885. But Edward Clark himself had become a kind of ghost in his own creation. His portrait hung somewhere within those walls. A reminder of the man whose foresight had made it possible. Residents who had never met him walked through spaces he had designed. They enjoyed comforts he had planned. They lived the life he had conceived for them, and they did so without ever knowing quite how much courage it had taken to build such a thing in such a place at such a time. The Dakota had proven the doubters wrong. Prosperous New Yorkers would live in apartments. They would accept neighbors on the other side of their walls. They would ride elevators and eat in communal dining rooms. They would entrust their daily comfort to a trained staff. All it had taken was a building grand enough to make such arrangements feel like privileges rather than compromises. Edward Clark's gamble had paid off spectacularly, but the old man himself had missed the vindication. He had died believing in something that did not yet exist, trusting that others would complete what he had started. The Dakota rose above 72nd Street exactly as he had planned it. And somewhere in those first months of operation, as tenants settled into their new lives and staff hurried through the corridors and the great building hummed with activity, Edward Clark's dream became simply reality. A place where people lived, a New York landmark, a testament to one man's refusal to accept the limits of his time. For 77 years, the Dakota belonged to one family. Edward Severin Clark had inherited the unfinished building at age 12. Trustees managed the property during his minority. By the time Edward Severin reached adulthood in the early 1890s and assumed direct control, the Dakota had already established itself as exactly what his grandfather had envisioned. The skeptics had been silenced. A waiting list had formed. The Upper West Side was no longer wilderness, but an increasingly fashionable district. Edward Severin proved to be a steady custodian. He was the eldest of 4 brothers. The others were Frederick Ambrose, Robert Sterling, and Stephen Carleton. All were heirs to the vast singer fortune their grandfather had accumulated. None of them needed the Dakota's rental income to survive. The sewing machine company continued to dominate its industry. It threw off dividends that dwarfed whatever the apartment house might produce. This financial independence shaped everything about how the Clarks managed their grandfather's creation. Rents remained surprisingly modest. Increases came slowly, if at all. Long-term tenants found their rates held steady for decades. A generosity that would have been impossible for a landlord who depended on the property for income. The Dakota functioned less as a commercial investment than as a kind of family legacy, maintained out of pride rather than necessity. The results were remarkable. Between 1884 and 1929, the building never had a single vacancy. 45 years of continuous full occupancy. Families arrived and stayed for generations. Children grew up within those walls, sometimes taking apartments of their own when they married. The Dakota developed the intimate character of a village. Its residents were bound by the peculiar experience of sharing such an extraordinary address. Among the early distinguished tenants were members of the Steinway family. Their pianos had become synonymous with musical excellence. Their presence established a pattern that would persist for decades. The Dakota attracted not merely wealth but culture, people who valued art and creativity alongside material success. Edward Severin Clark died on September 19, 1933, just weeks before the building's 50th anniversary. He left no children. At the time of his death, 2 tenants had lived in the Dakota since its very first days of operation in 1884. 4 other original residents had passed away in the preceding 3 years. The building was becoming a monument to continuity, its history measured in lifetimes. Ownership passed to Edward Severin's youngest brother, Stephen Carleton Clark. Stephen was a man of remarkable accomplishments beyond the family business. He had been a founding trustee of the Museum of Modern Art in 1929. He served as chairman of its board through the 1940s. In 1939, he established the Baseball Hall of Fame in Cooperstown, the family's ancestral home in upstate New York. He collected paintings by Rembrandt, Matisse, Degas, and Picasso. He approached everything with the same methodical intelligence that had characterized his grandfather's management of the Singer Empire. Stephen intended to continue operating the Dakota exactly as his brother had, preserving both the structure and the gardens to its west. For nearly 3 decades under his stewardship, little changed. The building even retained its original elevators, the same hydraulic machines that had astonished visitors in 1884. The Clarks handled all repairs and maintenance themselves, answerable to no outside authority, but time was working its slow transformations nonetheless. As the 20th century progressed, the elaborate services that had once defined Dakota living began to disappear. The laundry service went first, along with the tailoring and the resident housekeeper and her staff of maids. These amenities had always been expensive to maintain, and the social patterns that had made them desirable were changing. Families who had once relied entirely on the building staff learned to make other arrangements. Shortly after the Second World War, the dining room closed permanently. It had never operated at a profit. Edward Clark had conceived it as an inducement, a convenience to help wealthy families transition from private homes. But by the late 1940s, tenants preferred their own kitchens or the city's restaurants. The elaborate basement operation fell silent, By the 1950s, the servants' quarters on the upper floors had been converted into apartments. The staff that remained, 45 people by 1960 down from the original 150, no longer needed dormitories. The hidden world that had once supported gracious living had contracted to a fraction of its former scale. The tenant population was shifting too. Many residents by mid-century were diplomats, theatrical figures, or publishers. The building particularly appealed to people in the entertainment industry because of its proximity to the Broadway Theater District on the West Side. The Dakota was becoming known as a haven for creative personalities, a reputation it would carry into the decades ahead. Stephen Clark himself never lived in the building. He maintained a townhouse across the park on East 70th Street. As he entered his late 70s, the Dakota's residents grew anxious about the future. They invited him to dinners. They sent birthday greetings. They offered thoughtful Christmas gifts. Everyone wanted some hint of what would happen when the inevitable occurred. Clark gave no indication of his plans. He was absorbed in his art collection, his philanthropic work, his responsibilities to the institutions he had helped create. The Dakota was simply one asset among many. Stephen Carlton Clark died on September 17, 1960. He was 78 years old. When his will was read, the news troubled the residents deeply. Clark had not left the Dakota to his children or grandchildren. He had bequeathed it to the Clark Foundation, the charitable organization he had established in 1931 to support causes in Cooperstown. At first, this seemed acceptable. A foundation might prove a stable owner, less likely to make dramatic changes than an individual heir might be. But the tenants soon discovered a devastating legal reality. Under New York state law, a charitable foundation could not hold property that failed to generate profit. And the Dakota, for all its prestige, had never truly been profitable. The Clarks had kept rents artificially low. They had maintained services beyond what income justified. They had treated the building as a legacy rather than an investment. Under the foundation's ownership, this arrangement could not continue. By January 1961, the foundation had accepted an offer of $4.5 million from a developer who planned to demolish the building. He would replace it with a modern apartment tower. 77 years of family stewardship were about to end. The Dakota itself might cease to exist unless the tenants could find a way to save it. On the afternoon of Friday, December 17, 1960, Ernest A. Gross was sitting in his Wall Street office when the telephone rang. The caller was William Zeckendorf, the unquestioned czar of New York real estate. "I want to introduce myself," Zeckendorf said. "I am your new landlord." Gross was one of the Dakota's most distinguished residents, an international lawyer who had served 3 times as a delegate to the United Nations. He understood immediately what Zeckendorf's words implied. Whenever the developer acquired an old building on a choice piece of land, he raised it. He erected a tower of steel and glass in its place. "Buildings like the Dakota do not make sense in New York anymore," Zeckendorf told him. It had been barely 3 months since Stephen Clark's death. The Clark Foundation had moved quickly to divest itself of the unprofitable property. Zeckendorf claimed to have made an offer of $4.5 million that afternoon, with a deadline of noon on Monday. The foundation had indicated willingness to accept. The Dakota's residents had 2.5 days over a weekend to find some way to save their home. Gross immediately contacted his neighbor Charles Douglas Jackson. C.D. Jackson, as everyone called him, was a vice president of Time Incorporated, but his background ran deeper than magazine publishing. During the Second World War, he had served as deputy chief of the Psychological Warfare Division for the Allied Forces. Later, he had worked as a special assistant to President Eisenhower. If anyone knew how to mobilize resources under pressure, it was C.D. Jackson. The two men hastily called a meeting of the Dakota's tenants. The gathering convened in the old dining room. What unfolded there was pandemonium. Elderly tenants who had lived in the building for half a century confronted the prospect of eviction. The marble floors echoed with shouting, cursing, stamping, and sobbing. Judy Holliday was there, the actress who had won an Academy Award for Born Yesterday. She sat weeping. Recently diagnosed with terminal cancer, she wanted only to die in the building she considered home. Missy Bruce Leo appeared in a picture hat and trailing gown. She had not set foot outside her 18-room apartment in years. Some said she was 102 years old. "I will not be put out of my house," she kept shouting. "I will not be put out." The meeting dissolved into chaos. Gross and Jackson retreated to the Jackson apartment for drinks, to consider whether the Dakota could be saved at all. In the weeks that followed, the situation shifted. Zeckendorf's bid did not succeed. Instead, in January 1961, a different developer purchased the Dakota. The Glickman Corporation acquired the building and an adjoining lot for $46 million. Louis Glickman intended to demolish the building. He would construct what he boasted would be New York City's largest apartment tower. But the Dakota's residents were not without resources. Many were wealthy. More importantly, many were connected to media, to finance, to power. Through the winter and early spring, the tenants organized. They formed a cooperative corporation. They negotiated with Glickman. They appealed to whatever combination of sentiment, publicity, and financial pressure might persuade him to sell rather than demolish. In April 1961, they announced an agreement. They would purchase the Dakota for $48 million, $200,000 more than Glickman had paid just months earlier. Glickman would keep the adjoining lot and sell it separately. The deal required substantial sums from the tenants. Those who wished to remain would buy shares in the cooperative. They would convert from renters to owners. Many long-term residents who had paid artificially low rents for decades under the Clarks now faced monthly charges that exceeded their old payments significantly. Not everyone could afford the transition. An enclave of former servants of the Portuguese consul had remained on the 8th floor. They paid no rent even after their employer departed for Lisbon years earlier. They faced an impossible situation. The economics of cooperative ownership had no room for such arrangements, but most residents found ways to stay. In November 1961, the transaction was completed. The Dakota's tenants officially became its owners. For the first time in its history, the people who lived in the Dakota controlled its fate. The Glickman Corporation sold the adjacent lot that August. A bland apartment tower called the Mayfair rose on the site where gardens had once served the Dakota's residents. It was the kind of building that might have replaced the Dakota itself. Efficient, modern, utterly forgettable. The new cooperative faced immediate challenges. Under the Clarks, all maintenance and repairs had been funded from seemingly bottomless family resources. Now those costs fell to the residents. The building had aged gracefully but not always carefully. The original elevators, still operating after nearly 80 years, needed attention. In 1974, the co-op board undertook major repairs. The cost came to $500,000, about $5,000 per apartment. The residents paid it. They had saved the Dakota once. They would maintain it now. The conversion brought other changes. Under the Clarks, tenants came and went based on personal relationships and quiet understandings. The new cooperative required formal structure. A board of directors would govern the building. Prospective residents would need approval. Rules would be established. This formalization would eventually make the Dakota famous for the selectivity of its admissions process. But in 1961, such concerns lay in the future. What mattered was simpler. The building still stood. The tenants still lived there. The wrecking ball had been turned away. Edward Clark's creation, threatened with extinction, had been preserved by the very people for whom he had built it. While the Dakota survived on the Upper West Side, other forces were reshaping luxury apartment living across Manhattan. Edward Clark had proven that wealthy New Yorkers would accept apartments. Now other developers rushed to capitalize on his discovery. The race had actually begun years earlier. Even before the Dakota opened, investors were planning their own versions of apartment palaces. Each would try to outdo the others in grandeur and amenity. Each would compete for the same pool of prosperous tenants. William Earl Dodge Stokes was among the most eccentric of these developers. Born in 1852, he was the son of a successful merchant and real estate investor. He inherited a fortune while still young, and he had peculiar ideas about how to spend it. Stokes was obsessed with luxury, and with animals. These two obsessions would combine in extraordinary ways. In 1899, Stokes announced plans for a massive apartment hotel on Broadway between 73rd and 74th Streets. He would call it the Ansonia, after his grandfather Anson Green Phelps, a merchant and philanthropist. The building Stokes envisioned would dwarf the Dakota, 17 stories rising from a full block of Broadway frontage. It would contain 340 suites and 1,400 rooms. The structure would be fireproof throughout. Built of steel, terracotta, and brick, but the Ansonia's scale was not its most unusual feature. Stokes planned amenities that verged on the bizarre. The roof would house a working farm. Chickens would provide fresh eggs for residents. Goats would supply milk. At various times, Stokes kept a small bear up there as well. Why a bear? Because he could. The lobby would feature fountains, but not ordinary fountains. Stokes installed live seals in the water. Guests arriving at the Ansonia would be greeted by marine mammals swimming in marble basins. The basement held a swimming pool, one of the first in any residential building in New York. Turkish baths. Pneumatic tubes connected apartments to the lobby for messages and small deliveries. The walls were built extraordinarily thick. 18 inches of concrete and terracotta between apartments. This was deliberate. Stokes wanted to attract musicians and opera singers. The thick walls would block sound. Tenants could practice instruments or sing at full voice without disturbing neighbors. The strategy worked brilliantly. The Ansonia became famous as a haven for performers. Enrico Caruso moved in. The legendary Italian tenor was at the height of his fame. His voice was known around the world. At the Ansonia, he could rehearse without constraint. Arturo Toscanini took an apartment. The conductor had revolutionized orchestral performance. He demanded perfection from musicians. At the Ansonia, he found the piece to prepare. Florence Ziegfeld lived there, the theatrical producer behind the famous Ziegfeld Follies. Igor Stravinsky stayed at the Ansonia during his American tour. Lily Pons, the French soprano, made it her New York home. The building became known as a place where artistic temperament was not merely tolerated but expected. Musicians gathered in apartments to play chamber music. Singers tested new material. The Ansonia hummed with creativity. Stokes himself lived in the building, but his personal life was troubled. In 1911, his wife sued for divorce. She accused him of cruelty and adultery. The trial made headlines. She claimed he had brought prostitutes into their home, that he had flaunted his affairs openly. Stokes fought back viciously. He hired detectives to follow his wife. He spread rumors about her mental state. The divorce dragged on for years. It became a spectacle of Gilded Age marital warfare. Despite the scandal, the Ansonia thrived. It proved that the Dakota's success was not a fluke. Wealthy New Yorkers really would live in apartments if those apartments offered sufficient luxury and convenience. Other buildings followed. The Belnord opened in 1908 on West 86th Street, another massive structure built around a central courtyard. The Apthorpe opened the same year on Broadway between 78th and 79th Streets. It occupied a full city block. Italian Renaissance design, limestone facade, interior fountains and gardens. These buildings competed not just on size but on services. Each tried to offer something the others did not. Private wine cellars, billiard rooms, libraries, ballrooms. The apartment palace had become an established building type. Developers now understood the formula. Grand scale, lavish detail, hotel-style services, privacy combined with convenience. Henry Hardenberg, the architect who had designed the Dakota, received another major commission. In 1905, he began work on the Plaza Hotel at 5th Avenue and 59th Street. The plaza was conceived as both hotel and residence. Wealthy families could occupy suites permanently while enjoying full hotel amenities. The design drew on French Renaissance precedent: 18 stories of white brick and marble, mansard roof with prominent dormers, ornate interiors with gilt, crystal, and carved wood throughout. The plaza opened in October 1907. It immediately established itself as one of New York's most prestigious addresses. The location, overlooking Central Park from the southeast corner, was unbeatable. The services were impeccable. The apartments were enormous. The plaza proved something important. The wealthy would accept hotel living if the hotel was grand enough. The line between apartment and hotel was blurring. Both offered the same appeal: freedom from domestic burdens, professional staff handling every detail. Luxury without the exhaustion of maintaining a private mansion. By 1910, the transformation was undeniable. Apartment living had become respectable, fashionable even. Families who once would have scorned such arrangements now sought them out. The reasons were practical. Maintaining a private mansion in Manhattan was becoming prohibitively difficult. Good servants were harder to find. Wages were rising. Real estate taxes were increasing. The streets were noisier and more crowded. Privacy was harder to preserve. Meanwhile, the apartment palaces offered genuine advantages: central heating and cooling, electric lights, modern plumbing, elevators, professional security, trained staff, all without the burden of direct management. The social calculus was changing too. The old Knickerbocker families who had dominated New York society were losing influence. New fortunes were being made in industry, finance, and commerce. The newcomers cared less about tradition. They wanted comfort and convenience. Apartments provided both. The First World War accelerated the shift. The conflict disrupted everything. Young men went overseas. Women took jobs in factories. The rigid social hierarchies of the Gilded Age began to crack. When the war ended, the world that had existed before was gone. Servant labor had dried up. Many domestic workers had found better opportunities. They would not return to the old arrangements. For families trying to maintain large private homes, the situation became untenable. Heating a mansion required constant attention. Cooking for a household meant hours of work. Laundry was an ordeal. Cleaning was endless. The apartment palaces offered escape. Let someone else worry about the boilers and the plumbing. Let professional staff handle the cooking and cleaning. Pay one monthly sum and be done with it. By 1920, the transformation was complete. The Fifth Avenue mansions that had symbolized Gilded Age wealth were white elephants, expensive to maintain, difficult to sell, increasingly out of step with modern life. Some were converted into apartments themselves. Others became museums or were demolished to make way for commercial development. The mansion era had ended. Edward Clark had been right. His vision in 1880 had seemed radical. By 1920, it had become common sense. The apartment palace was not a novelty. It was the future. The Dakota had attracted artists from the very beginning. The composer Pyotr Tchaikovsky visited during his American tour in 1891. He dined in the building and marveled at its amenities. Other distinguished guests followed over the decades, drawn by residents who moved in artistic and intellectual circles. Piano manufacturers lived alongside patrons of the opera and supporters of the symphony. For nearly 50 years, the Dakota remained a haven for prosperous families of a particular cultural bent. The building developed a character distinct from the purely social addresses of Fifth Avenue. It was respectable without being stuffy, elegant without being rigid. Then, in the middle of the 20th century, the actors began to arrive. Boris Karloff was among the first. The British actor had achieved international fame in 1931 as the monster in Frankenstein, a role that would define his career. By the 1950s, he had moved to New York to pursue stage work. He took an apartment in the Dakota with his wife Evelyn. Some residents reportedly objected. Having a performer in the building they feared might lower its tone. Actors were not quite respectable. They worked odd hours. They kept unusual company. They attracted unwanted attention. The Dakota had always been discreet. Their fears proved unfounded. Karloff was a gentleman, soft-spoken, cultured, devoted to his craft. He lived quietly for years, pursuing work that ranged from Broadway to television to radio. He narrated the animated special How the Grinch Stole Christmas in 1966. He won a Grammy Award for it. He remained in the building until his death in 1969. More importantly, Karloff opened the door. If the man who played Frankenstein's monster could live respectably at 72nd Street, so could other performers. In the decades that followed, actors and musicians would find their way to the Dakota in increasing numbers. Lillian Gish took an apartment. The legendary star of silent cinema had worked with D.W. Griffith in the earliest days of American film. She had survived the transition to sound and continued working into her 90s. She brought with her the history of an entire art form. Judy Garland lived briefly in the building during the 1960s. By then, the star of The Wizard of Oz was struggling with the personal demons that would claim her life in 1969. Her time at the Dakota was short and troubled, but her presence added another layer to the building's legend. Lauren Bacall arrived in 1961, the same year the tenants organized to save the building from demolition. She purchased a sprawling 9-room apartment for $68,000, a substantial sum then, a fraction of what it would later be worth. Bacall had been a Hollywood star since the 1940s, famous for her sultry voice and her marriage to Humphrey Bogart. After Bogart's death, she had rebuilt her life around Broadway. She would live in the Dakota for 53 years until her death in 2014. She became one of the building's fixtures, a living connection to Hollywood's golden age. When residents gathered for the annual Christmas party, Bacall contributed elaborate homemade desserts. Leonard Bernstein moved into a second-floor apartment with sweeping views of Central Park. The composer and conductor was at the height of his fame. He had created West Side Story and led the New York Philharmonic to international acclaim. His apartment became a gathering place for musicians and intellectuals. The Dakota's construction, those massive walls designed for privacy and quiet, allowed him to work at his piano without disturbing neighbors. The pattern was clear. The Dakota attracted creative people. Something about the building appealed to artists. Perhaps it was the apartments themselves. Vast spaces with soaring ceilings and rooms that flowed into one another. Spaces that could accommodate a grand piano or a painter's studio. Perhaps it was the building's character, that sense of a world apart from ordinary Manhattan. Perhaps it was simply tradition. The economics helped as well. Under the Clarks' long ownership, rents had remained modest. Even after the cooperative conversion, the Dakota offered grandeur on terms that creative careers could sustain. By the late 1960s, the building had become known as a haven for exactly the kind of people its original residents had feared: performers, musicians, writers, celebrities of every description. The address that had once attracted industrialists now attracted artists. Among the residents in 1973 was the actor Robert Ryan, a craggy character actor known for films like The Dirty Dozen. Ryan was dying of cancer that year. His apartment on the 7th floor would soon become available. A young English musician and his Japanese-American wife were looking for a place to live. They had heard about the Dakota. They wondered if they might sublet Robert Ryan's apartment. Their names were John Lennon and Yoko Ono. In the spring of 1973, a former Beatle and his avant-garde wife were searching for a new home in Manhattan. John Lennon and Yoko Ono had been living in the West Village, but they wanted something grander, something with history. Their assistant made inquiries at the Dakota. As it happened, Robert Ryan was preparing to vacate Unit 72 on the 7th floor. His wife had recently died. He could no longer bear to remain in the space they had shared. Ryan himself would die of lung cancer within months. A single viewing was all it took. The place ran half the length of a city block, 4 bedrooms. Stunning views across Central Park's treetops with a distant glimpse of the lake beyond. But what truly captivated John was the feel of it. Heavy brass light switches, sit-down elevators operated by attendants in uniform, mahogany and oak and cherrywood paneling throughout. It reminded him of Victorian Liverpool, the world of his childhood. The co-op board was not immediately enthusiastic. Some residents feared the couple would host loud parties with amplifiers. There had been drug-related charges in England, but the Lennons proved the skeptics wrong. Once installed, they kept almost entirely to themselves. They gave no parties, they sought absolute privacy. This did not make them invisible. When the couple emerged, they were impossible to miss. John favored blue jeans paired with a long black cape and a wide-brimmed sombrero, sometimes sucking on a pacifier. Yoko accompanied him in dramatic hairdos that changed weekly. They would step into matching silver limousines and glide away into the city. Devoted fans knew exactly where to find them. Despite security guards and the gated entrance, admirers sometimes slipped inside. They roamed the corridors, they rang doorbells, they searched for their hero. Lauren Bacall was known to scold the loiterers when she came and went. This made some of them cry, which upset John. He loved his fans even when they invaded his privacy. The Lennons eventually owned 5 units in the Dakota, 2 for storage, 1 as a studio, 2 for guests. Yoko established her business offices in a ground floor space called Studio One. From there she managed their considerable affairs. On October 9, 1975, everything changed. That day was John's 35th birthday. It was also the day his son Sean Tara Ono Lennon was born. John had an older son, Julian, from his first marriage, but that relationship had suffered during the years when Beatlemania consumed his life. He carried guilt about this. When Sean arrived, he made a decision. He retired from music. For the next 5 years, John Lennon became a house husband. While Yoko spent her days downstairs negotiating deals and managing investments, John stayed upstairs with Sean. He baked bread. He supervised the nanny. He sang his son to sleep. He watched the seasons change over Central Park. His guitar hung on a nail above the bed, untouched for months at a time. His neighbors came to know a different man than the one who had screamed through Stadium Tour. They encountered a quiet father pushing a stroller through the courtyard, a polite eccentric who appeared at the annual potluck dinner on the first Wednesday of October, bringing macrobiotic dishes. Roberta Flack lived next door. The Grammy-winning singer had moved in during the early 1970s. She became the Dakota's first African-American resident. She and the Lennons were friendly, though she later observed that most artists in the place tended to keep to themselves. Sean would eventually call her Aunt Roberta. In July 1976, John finally received his green card after years of legal battles. He was free to leave America and return at will. In 1978, he and Yoko purchased a 600-acre dairy farm in upstate New York. John bought a herd of 122 Holstein cows. He seemed to be building a life as far from rock stardom as possible. By the summer of 1980, Sean was approaching his 5th birthday. John had been away from recording for half a decade. Then something shifted. In June, he traveled to Bermuda with an acoustic guitar. Alone with his thoughts, he began writing again. The songs came in a flood. Woman, beautiful boy, watching the wheels, starting over. He called Yoko. He played the new compositions over the phone. She had been writing too. They decided to make a record together, alternating tracks, a dialogue between husband and wife. John returned transformed. He booked time at the Hit Factory studio. He assembled a band. In August 1980, for the first time in 5 years, he went back to work. The album would be called Double Fantasy. It was released on November 17. Reviews were mixed, but sales were strong. John gave interviews for the first time in years. He spoke openly about his retreat and his joy at returning. He seemed happy. He spoke of more records. He spoke of touring. He spoke of the future. 3 weeks after the release, on December 8, John and Yoko spent the afternoon at the record plant. They were working on a track of hers called Walking on Thin Ice. John added a guitar part that crackled with energy. When they finished, he turned to his wife. Yoko, he said, I think you just cut your first number 1. They left the studio and headed home. Sean would be waiting. It was almost his bedtime. The limousine pulled up to the Dakota's entrance on 72nd Street around 10:50 in the evening. John and Yoko stepped out onto the sidewalk. The temperature was cold, December in New York. The street was quiet. A man approached from the shadows near the archway. His name was Mark David Chapman. He had been waiting for hours. Earlier that same day, he had asked John to sign an album. John had obliged. Chapman had thanked him. Now Chapman raised a revolver. He fired 5 times. 4 bullets struck John in the back and shoulder. John staggered into the Dakota's entrance. He collapsed in the security office. The doorman screamed for help. Police arrived within minutes. They rushed John to Roosevelt Hospital. Doctors worked desperately to save him, but the damage was too severe. He had lost too much blood. John Lennon was pronounced dead at 11:07 p.m. He was 40 years old. The news spread instantly. Radio stations interrupted their programming. Television networks broke into scheduled broadcasts. By midnight, crowds had gathered outside the Dakota. People stood in shock. Some wept openly. Others sang Beatles songs. The vigil continued for days. Thousands of people came to 72nd Street. They left flowers, they left candles, they left photographs and letters. The sidewalk outside the Dakota became a shrine. Inside the building, Yoko tried to comprehend what had happened. Sean, not yet 5 years old, asked where his father had gone. The world wanted to mourn with her, but she needed time. She needed privacy. She needed to grieve as a mother and a widow before she could face the public. 10 days later, on December 14, Yoko issued a statement. She asked for 10 minutes of silence at 2:00 p.m. Eastern Time. People around the world would pause together to remember John. In New York, hundreds of thousands gathered in Central Park, directly across from the Dakota. The crowd stretched from 72nd Street to the Bethesda Fountain. At precisely 2:00 p.m., the entire mass fell silent. The only sound was wind in the trees. It was one of the most profound moments in the city's history. The Dakota would never be the same. The building that had witnessed nearly a century of New York history had become the site of one of the 20th century's most shocking crimes. The archway where John had fallen would forever be associated with his death. Tourists began arriving, not just fans of the Beatles, anyone who had heard the news. They wanted to see the place where it happened. They wanted to stand where John had stood. They wanted to understand how such a thing could occur. The Dakota's residents found themselves living in a monument. The building's fame, already considerable, had become overwhelming. The address that had once meant luxury and exclusivity now meant tragedy as well. If you stand at the windows of the Dakota and look across Central Park West, you can see a teardrop-shaped clearing in the trees. This is Strawberry Fields, the memorial that Yoko Ono created for her husband. It did not exist when John was alive. The patch of land at 72nd Street was an unremarkable section of Central Park, isolated between roadways and showing signs of decay like much of the park in those years. But it happened to be where John and Yoko took their daily walks. They would cross the street from the Dakota. They would enter the park. They would wander the paths together for hours. 10 days after the murder, on December 18, 1980, City Council member Henry Stern introduced legislation to rename this section of the park. On March 26, 1981, the designation became official. The teardrop-shaped knoll would be called Strawberry Fields, after the Beatles' song John had written in 1966. The song itself was named for a place in Liverpool. Strawberry Field was a Salvation Army children's home near the house where John grew up. As a boy, he would sneak into the grounds to play with the orphans. His Aunt Mimi disapproved, but John kept going. Years later, he transformed those memories into one of the Beatles' most surreal and beautiful recordings. Yoko wanted to transform the New York site into something equally meaningful. In an open letter published in the New York Times in 1981, she invited countries from around the world to contribute plants and stones for what she called a garden of peace. She did not want a statue. John would not have wanted a statue. He would have wanted something alive. It would be nice to have the whole world in one place, she wrote. One field living and growing together in harmony. The response was extraordinary. More than 120 countries sent donations. An oak tree from Great Britain, dogwoods from Monaco, tulip bulbs from the Netherlands, maples from Canada, strawberry plants of course from the Central Park Conservancy itself. Yoko contributed $1 million to the project. Half went to the redesign and landscaping. Half went into an endowment for perpetual maintenance. She worked closely with Bruce Kelly, the chief landscape architect for the Central Park Conservancy. to create something that would feel both peaceful and alive. Kelly designed a series of meandering paths through small meadows lined with trees and shrubs. The landscape was meant to integrate with the original vision of Frederick Law Olmsted, who had designed Central Park more than a century earlier. This was not a monument imposed upon the park. It was a restoration of what the park was meant to be. At the western point of the garden, Kelly and Ono placed a focal element. Artisans from Naples, Italy, crafted a circular mosaic of black and white stones in a starburst pattern. At its center was a single word: imagine. The mosaic referenced John's most famous solo song, the one he had recorded in 1971, but Yoko later revealed that much of the song's concept had come from her own artwork and writings. The word belonged to both of them. On October 9, 1985, Strawberry Fields was dedicated. The date was John's birthday. He would have been 45 years old. It was also Sean's 10th birthday. Yoko stood before several hundred guests with her arm around her son. Mayor Edward Koch joined her on the small stage. Roberta Flack was there. So was the actor Michael Douglas and dozens of United Nations officials, representing the countries that had contributed to the garden. "This garden is the result of all of us dreaming together," Yoko told the crowd. She borrowed a line from the Beatles. "It is our way of taking a sad song and making it better." Koch called it a tranquil glade that embodied John's vision of peace. In the decades since, Strawberry Fields has become one of the most visited sites in Central Park. Fans come from around the world to lay flowers on the Imagine mosaic, to sit on the benches, to sing Beatles songs with strangers. On October 9 each year and again on December 8, the gatherings grow larger. Musicians bring guitars. Someone always leads the crowd in Give Peace a Chance. The memorial is designated a quiet zone, but it is rarely quiet. The silence is filled with music. From her windows in the Dakota, Yoko could look down at the mosaic for decades. She finally left the building in 2023, 50 years after she and John first moved in. But the word Imagine remains visible from those windows, surrounded by flowers that visitors leave behind. The Dakota and Strawberry Fields face each other now like two halves of a conversation. The building where John lived and died, the garden where his memory lives on. They are separated only by a street, bound together by grief and music and the stubborn human need to remember. The Dakota has survived for more than 140 years. It has outlasted the empty lots that once surrounded it. The horse-drawn carriages that once passed through its courtyard, and the gaslit city that gave it birth. It has seen Manhattan transform around it while remaining essentially unchanged. In February 1969, the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission designated the Dakota as an official city landmark. 3 years later, it was added to the National Register of Historic Places. In 1976, it received the highest honor: designation as a National Historic Landmark. The structure that critics once called Clark's Folly was now recognized as one of the most significant in America. These designations brought both protection and constraint. Any modification to the exterior now required approval from the Landmarks Commission. When the slate roof began failing in the 1970s, residents discovered that a full restoration would cost $1 million. They settled for a more modest repair. When some wanted to install air conditioners, units that protruded through the facade were banned. The Dakota's appearance was no longer entirely in its owner's hands, but it endured. The original elevators with their sit-down operators continued to carry residents between floors. The courtyard fountain continued to splash. The gates continued to swing open for those who belonged and close against those who did not. Getting through those gates has never been easy. When the tenants converted the Dakota to a cooperative in 1961, they created a board with the power to approve or reject prospective buyers. The members take this responsibility seriously. They review financial statements, they conduct interviews, they consider whether a candidate will fit the culture of the place, and they are under no obligation to explain their decisions. Over the decades, the list of rejected applicants has become almost as famous as the list of residents. Madonna applied and was turned away. So was Billy Joel, so was Cher. Carly Simon, despite her Upper West Side credentials, was rejected. When Melanie Griffith and Antonio Banderas sought to purchase an apartment, the board said no. Alex Rodriguez, the baseball star, was denied. The filmmaker Judd Apatow was refused. The reasons are rarely disclosed. Some rejections reportedly stemmed from concerns about fans and paparazzi. Others from questions about lifestyle. The board once worried that Billy Joel might attract groupies, but the Dakota has never been hostile to fame itself. Judy Garland lived there. So did Lauren Bacall for more than 50 years. Leonard Bernstein composed music in a grand apartment overlooking the park. John Lennon and Yoko Ono raised their son behind those walls. The place has welcomed actors, musicians, writers, and artists for generations. What the board seems to prize is discretion. The Dakota offers privacy in a city where privacy is almost impossible to find. Residents do not discuss their neighbors with reporters. They do not invite cameras into the courtyard. They understand that the mystique depends on a certain silence. Today, apartments here sell for prices that would have astonished Edward Clark. Units have been listed for as much as $20 million. Even modest units command several million. The annual maintenance fees can reach 6 figures. This is no longer a place for the merely prosperous. It is a fortress of wealth, and yet the Dakota remains something more than real estate. It is a piece of living history, a reminder of what New York once was and what it aspired to become. The tourists who gather on the sidewalk outside are not there to admire square footage. They come because this address represents something: ambition, artistry, tragedy, endurance. They come because Rosemary walked through that archway in a film that still disturbs. They come because John Lennon signed an autograph in that entrance and never made it inside. They come because the Dakota has become a character in the story of New York itself. From the upper floors, residents can still look out over Central Park and see the city Edward Clark imagined. The park stretches toward the distant skyscrapers of Midtown. The trees have grown tall. The neighborhood has become one of the most desirable in the world. Directly below, just across the street, lies Strawberry Fields. The imagined mosaic is visible from certain windows. Visitors leave flowers there every day, singing songs written by a man who lived here for 7 years and died in its shadow. The Dakota stands at the intersection of memory and money, art and exclusivity, fame and privacy. It has meant different things to different generations. For some, it represents the Gilded Age dream of luxury and refinement. For others, it is the Bramford, a place of nightmare and conspiracy. For millions of Beatles fans, it will always be the place where John Lennon came home. But the Dakota is more than one building. It is a symbol of a revolution that changed American cities forever. Edward Clark did not just construct an apartment house. He proved that the wealthy would abandon their mansions for something better. The Ansonia followed, with its rooftop farm and opera stars. The plaza rose at 5th Avenue, offering hotel services in permanent residences. Buildings across Manhattan competed to offer grander lobbies, thicker walls, more elaborate amenities. By 1920, the transformation was complete. The mansion era had ended. Apartment living had become not just acceptable but preferable. The burden of maintaining a private palace had become unbearable. The convenience of apartment life had won. Today, luxury apartments define urban living around the world. Penthouses in glass towers sell for hundreds of millions. Doormen and concierges manage every detail of residents' lives. Fitness centers and private dining rooms offer amenities that rival hotels. None of this would exist without the pioneers, without Edward Clark betting his fortune on a wilderness apartment palace, without William Stokes putting chickens on his roof and seals in his lobby, without Henry Hardenberg designing spaces grand enough to satisfy millionaire pride. The Gilded Age apartment buildings proved something fundamental about human nature. Given the choice between responsibility and convenience, people will choose convenience. Even the wealthy, perhaps especially the wealthy, A mansion meant status, but it also meant endless work, staff to manage, systems to maintain, problems to solve. The apartment palaces offered escape. Let someone else worry about the details. Pay your fee and live like royalty. This insight reshaped cities. It made urban density luxurious rather than merely necessary. It allowed more people to live in desirable neighborhoods. It created the vertical city we know today. The Dakota, the Ansonia, the Plaza, and their contemporaries were not just buildings. They were arguments. Demonstrations that another way of living was possible, that tradition could be overcome, that the future did not have to resemble the past. Edward Clark never saw his building completed. He died believing in something that did not yet exist, trusting others to finish what he had started. But his vision proved correct. The skeptics who laughed at Clark's folly were wrong. The Dakota opened in 1884 with every apartment rented. A waiting list formed. The Upper West Side transformed from wilderness to one of Manhattan's finest neighborhoods, and the apartment palace became the standard for urban luxury. 140 years later, the Dakota endures. The gates still open. The courtyard still beckons. The apartments, no two alike, still shelter those who have earned the right to call this place home. The building that Edward Clark conceived and Henry Hardenberg designed, and generations of residents have preserved, stands as testament to a single revolutionary idea: that you do not need to own a palace to live like royalty. You only need to share one. The Gilded Age apartment buildings changed elite living forever. They proved that convenience conquers tradition. They demonstrated that luxury does not require isolation. They showed that the wealthy, like everyone else, simply want to live comfortably without unnecessary burden. This is the legacy of the Dakota and the buildings it inspired. Not just beautiful architecture, not just prestigious addresses, but a fundamental reimagining of what home could mean. Edward Clark gambled his reputation on this vision. He built his apartment palace in the wilderness. He filled it with the finest materials and most modern conveniences, and he proved that the future belonged not to private mansions but to shared luxury. The revolution he started never ended. It spread from New York to cities around the world. It made apartment living not just acceptable but aspirational. It created the urban landscape we inhabit today. The Dakota stands as monument to that revolution, to the courage it took to imagine something new, to the vision required to see beyond tradition, to the persistence needed to prove the skeptics wrong. 140 years after its completion, the Dakota remains what it always was: something unprecedented, something singular, something that could exist nowhere else but New York. The building that was once called Folly became legend. The fortress in the wilderness became the most coveted address in America. And the man who died before seeing his dream completed got the last word after all. Edward Clark was right. The future belonged to apartment palaces. The Gilded Age buildings that revolutionized elite living changed everything. And they changed it forever. The story of the Gilded Age apartment buildings is ultimately a story about change, about how Americans learned to live differently, about how luxury evolved from something you owned alone to something you could share with others, about how the impossible became inevitable. In 1880, no respectable wealthy family would consider living in an apartment. The very idea was insulting. Apartments were for immigrants, for the poor, for people who could not afford anything better. Mansions defined success. Your home announced your status to the world. The bigger your house, the more important you were. But maintaining that status was exhausting. The work never ended. Servants needed supervision, furnaces needed coal, lamps needed oil, carpets needed beating, silver needed polishing, windows needed washing. Something always broke. The roof leaked. The pipes froze, the boiler failed. Wealthy women spent their entire days managing these details. They planned menus. They inspected linen closets. They supervised repairs. They ordered supplies. Their lives revolved around domestic management. It was proper, it was expected, but it was also relentless. Meanwhile, their husbands dealt with other burdens. Property taxes kept rising. Good servants became harder to find. The streets grew noisier and more crowded. privacy became harder to maintain. The mansion that once symbolized success was starting to feel like a trap. Edward Clark understood this. He had watched European cities. He had seen how wealthy Parisians lived comfortably in grand apartments, no loss of status, no compromise in luxury, just freedom from endless domestic burden. He decided to prove that New York could work the same way. He bought land in the wilderness of the Upper West Side. He hired an ambitious young architect. He spent $2 million building something unprecedented, and he died before seeing whether his gamble would succeed. But the Dakota proved him right. Within months of opening, every apartment was rented. A waiting list formed. The wealthy discovered something liberating. They could live graciously without the burden of maintaining their own palace. This discovery changed everything. Other developers noticed. If Clark could succeed with apartments for the rich, so could they. The race began. William Stokes built the Ansonia with its rooftop farm and swimming pool and opera stars. The Apthorpe and the Belnord rose as massive structures occupying full city blocks. Henry Hardenberg designed the plaza to combine hotel services with permanent residences. Each building competed to offer something the others did not. Thicker walls, grander lobbies, more elaborate services. The apartment palace became an established building type. Developers understood the formula. Grand scale, lavish detail, hotel-style amenities, privacy combined with convenience. The First World War accelerated the transformation. The conflict disrupted everything. Servant labor dried up. Many domestic workers found better opportunities. They did not return to the old arrangements. Maintaining a private mansion became nearly impossible. Who would heat the furnaces? Who would cook the meals? Who would clean the endless rooms? The apartment palaces offered escape. Professional staff handled everything. Residents simply paid their monthly fee. By 1920, the mansion era had ended. Fifth Avenue's grand houses were white elephants, expensive to maintain, difficult to sell, increasingly out of step with modern life. Some were converted into apartments, others became museums, many were simply demolished. The transformation was complete. Edward Clark's radical vision had become common sense. Apartment living was not just acceptable, it was preferable. The buildings themselves became part of New York's identity. The Dakota with its Gothic mystery and tragic history, the Ansonia with its artistic community and eccentric founder, the Plaza with its elegance and prestige. They were more than addresses, they were landmarks, symbols of a particular moment in American history. These structures witnessed decades of change. They housed Gilded Age bankers and their families. They attracted opera stars and composers. They became havens for actors and writers. They survived the Depression, the World Wars, the turbulent 1960s, the fiscal crisis of the 1970s. They adapted to new times while preserving their essential character. Services changed. The elaborate dining rooms closed, the laundries disappeared, the armies of servants shrank, but the buildings endured. When the Clark family could no longer maintain the Dakota, the residents organized to save it. They formed a cooperative, they bought shares, they became owners instead of tenants. This model spread to other buildings. The residents who lived in these palaces took control of their own homes. The cooperative structure created something unique. Buildings that were simultaneously exclusive and communal. Boards could reject applicants, they could maintain standards, they could preserve the character that made these places special. This selectivity became legendary. The Dakota rejected Madonna and Billy Joel and Cher, not because they lacked money or fame, but because the board valued discretion above celebrity. The mystique depended on privacy, on residents who understood that living in a palace required respecting its traditions. Yet the buildings continued to attract creative people. Actors, musicians, writers, artists of every kind. Something about these spaces appealed to creative temperament. Perhaps the grand proportions, perhaps the thick walls that blocked sound, perhaps simply the sense of living in a place with history and character. John Lennon found sanctuary at the Dakota. He raised his son there. He baked bread and pushed a stroller through the courtyard. He seemed to have found peace after years of chaos. Then on a December night in 1980, he was murdered in the archway where he had lived. The tragedy made the Dakota famous in a new way. It became a site of pilgrimage. Fans came from around the world. They stood on the sidewalk. They left flowers. They sang Beatles songs. The building that had witnessed a century of New York history had become the scene of one of its most shocking crimes. Yoko Ono created strawberry fields across the street, a garden of peace. More than 120 countries contributed plants and stones. At its center, a mosaic with a single word, imagine. The memorial became one of Central Park's most visited sites, a place where strangers gathered to remember and to mourn. The Dakota and strawberry fields face each other across Central Park West, two halves of a story, the building where John lived, the garden where his memory endures. Separated by a street, bound together by tragedy and music and the human need to remember. Today, these Gilded Age apartment buildings remain among New York's most prestigious addresses. Apartments sell for millions, sometimes tens of millions. The annual maintenance fees rival the mortgages on suburban houses. This is luxury on a scale that would have astonished even the original builders. But the buildings are more than expensive real estate. They are monuments to a particular vision, to the idea that you could have grandeur without burden, luxury without responsibility, the pleasures of wealth without its endless obligations. Edward Clark proved that vision was correct. The wealthy would abandon their mansions if offered something better. The Dakota succeeded not because it compromised, but because it exceeded what private homes could offer. The same money that barely maintained a townhouse could provide access to professional staff, modern systems, and continuous maintenance. The same space that required constant supervision in a mansion could be enjoyed without worry in an apartment palace. This was the revolution, not just new buildings, but a new way of understanding what luxury meant. Luxury was not isolation, it was convenience, it was freedom from domestic burden. It was the ability to enjoy wealth without being enslaved by it. The insight reshaped cities around the world. Today, luxury apartments define urban living everywhere. Penthouses in glass towers command record prices. Doormen and concierges manage every detail. Fitness centers and private dining rooms offer amenities that rival hotels. The vertical city that emerged in the 20th century began with the Gilded Age apartment palaces. They proved that density could be luxurious, that living among neighbors did not mean compromising comfort, that convenience could conquer tradition. The buildings themselves have become icons. The Dakota appears in films and novels. Tourists photograph its Gothic facade. The Ansonia houses artists and musicians in the tradition William Stokes established over a century ago. The plaza remains one of the world's most recognizable hotels. These structures survived because they were built to last. Massive walls, superior materials, careful maintenance, but they also survived because they served a genuine need. They offered something people wanted. Freedom from the burden of maintaining a private palace while preserving the pleasures of gracious living. Edward Clark died before seeing his vision realized. He never walked through the finished Dakota, never dined in its baronial hall, never heard residents praising what he had created. But his legacy endures in every apartment building that followed. The skeptics called his project folly. They said wealthy New Yorkers would never accept apartment living. They predicted failure. They were wrong about everything. The Dakota opened with every unit rented. The Upper West Side transformed from wilderness to one of Manhattan's finest neighborhoods, and apartment living became not just acceptable but the standard for urban luxury. 140 years later, the revolution continues. Cities around the world build upward. Luxury apartments define urban prestige. The mansion era belongs to history. The future Edward Clark imagined has become the present we inhabit. The Gilded Age buildings that revolutionized elite living proved something fundamental. That progress means letting go of tradition. That convenience matters more than convention, that the future belongs to those brave enough to imagine it. Edward Clark was brave enough. He built his apartment palace in the wilderness. He filled it with every modern convenience. He created something unprecedented, and he changed how Americans live. The Dakota stands today as testament to his vision, to the courage it took to challenge tradition, to the persistence required to prove skeptics wrong, to the fundamental insight that luxury means freedom, not responsibility. The building has witnessed nearly 150 years of New York history. Gilded Age fortunes were made and lost within its walls. Hollywood discovered its Gothic mystery. Artists and musicians found sanctuary behind its gates. And on a December night, the world watched in horror as one of music's greatest icons was gunned down in its archway. Through it all, the Dakota endured. The gates still open for those who belong. The courtyard still offers refuge from the city outside. The apartments still shelter residents who understand what it means to live in a palace. But the Dakota is not alone. It is part of a family of buildings that changed everything. The Ansonia, the Plaza, the Apthorpe, the Belnord. Dozens of others that followed their example. Together, they represent a revolution in how Americans chose to live. These buildings proved that you do not need to own a palace to live like royalty. You only need to share one. This simple insight transformed cities. It made urban density luxurious. It created the vertical metropolis we know today. The revolution began with Edward Clark's gamble, with Henry Hardenberg's designs, with William Stokes' eccentricity, with residents willing to try something new. It succeeded because it offered genuine benefits, freedom, convenience, luxury without burden. 140 years after the Dakota opened, the lesson remains clear. Progress means challenging assumptions. Innovation requires courage. And the future belongs to those who dare to imagine something better. The Gilded Age apartment buildings that revolutionized elite living changed more than architecture. They changed how we think about home, about community, about what it means to live well. Edward Clark built a fortress in the wilderness. The skeptics laughed. They called it folly. They predicted failure. But the fortress became a legend. The folly became the future. And the man who died before seeing his dream completed got the last word after all. The Dakota endures. The revolution continues. And the buildings that changed everything remain standing as monuments to vision, courage, and the power of one man's refusal to accept the limits of his time. This is the story of the Gilded Age buildings that revolutionized elite living. A story of fortunes made from sewing machines, of architects who dared to dream in stone and steel, of residents who chose convenience over tradition, of buildings that became more than addresses. They became legends, and the legend continues.